Hello, this is Chapter 9 in Political Science Research Methods, and today we're going to talk about quantitative research designs. Now, in the last chapter, we talked about some of the different ways that you can conduct qualitative research. We discussed a number of the different methods that you can use to conduct that type of qualitative research. Some of those being like case studies and doing participant observations and things along those lines. In this chapter, we're going to talk about the different ways that you can conduct quantitative research. If you remember from the beginning, qualitative research is focused on meanings and tracing processes, and you typically use a small number of cases. In quantitative research, we're more focused on averages, trends, and making predictions. Qualitative research tends to be words, phrases, and text, and quantitative data tends to be more numerical. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about the different designs that you can use in order to study that numerical data in order to establish trends, make predictions, and determine averages. So in quantitative research, we typically have large N designs. And if you remember, N just refers to the number of cases that you're going to use. Just like in qualitative research, we have a focus on establishing internal validity and external validity. Internal validity refers to the ability of your test, your design to actually test the things that you're interested in testing. External validity means the ability for what you find in your study to actually apply to the larger population. It's about inferences and being able to jump to make inferences about that population. So in quantitative research, there are several different designs that you can use to study political phenomena. They typically fall into two categories. You have experimental studies and observational studies, or some use the terms experimental research versus non-experimental research. So the first portion of this lecture is going to focus on the different forms of experimental research, and the last portion focuses on the different forms of non-experimental or observational research. Remember, qualitative research focuses on explaining meaning, tracing processes, and quantitative research focuses on trends, averages, and predictions. Those are two very important distinctions to make because it speaks a lot about your data and the type of research you're doing. So for our purposes in this lecture, we're going to use two examples we use throughout class. We're going to use the study of coffee's effect on test scores for students and the relationship between money or income and education. We'll use those examples as I go through and explain each one of these designs to you. So let's do a brief refresher of what an experiment is. So classical experiments, they're sometimes referred to as true experiments. They include a number of things that are very important in distinguishing them from other types of research designs. First, they have a controlled environment. Classic experiments or true experiments typically take place in a controlled environment like a laboratory, or let's say a clean classroom where nobody else is allowed. Think lab form, right? Next, they always include a control group and an experimental group. The experimental group would be the group that receives the treatment or the manipulation, and the control group would be the group that is unaltered. The next thing that is included is that with having those control groups and those experimental groups, you have to have random assignment. Random assignment refers to each participant being placed in either the control group or the experimental group randomly. There's no pattern through which they are selected to make sure that the two groups are balanced as far as their characteristics. The next thing is that in order to have an experiment, and this is very important, you have to have some form of treatment or manipulation. There has to be something that is applied or adjusted by you, the researcher, or by an outside force in a very specific instance that is supposed to be causing the difference that we see between the two groups. So keep that in mind. And the final thing in a classic experiment is that you have a pre and a post test. That means that we have measurements for before the treatment and manipulation happen, and we have a measure for after the treatment or manipulation happens. So let's think back to our example. If we're talking about coffee and students' performance on tests, In order to have a classic experiment to see how these two things work together, first we need a controlled environment. So let's say we have our laboratory classroom that students are going to come into. That will be our controlled environment. We're in a situation to where we can choose whether or not the participants receive treatment. That's the first thing that we have to do. Next, we have to have a control group and an experimental group. In this example, our independent variable is coffee. So that means that one group will receive the independent variable and the other group will not. The group that receives the independent variable, or the manipulation on the independent variable, would be the experimental group. The group that does not receive the manipulation on the independent variable would be the control group. Next, we have to make sure that the way these people get into these groups is completely random. Now, I could go through the process of drawing names out of a hat, or I could go through the process of using some sort of computer software to randomly place them in groups. And then, as I said, we have to make sure we have some sort of manipulation on the independent variable, which would be having coffee. And then we have to have pre and post test results. So that means that I have to have a test score, because test scores is our dependent variable, the outcome that we're looking at. I have to have a test score for before the coffee takes place or is drank, or is that before somebody drinks the coffee, and I have to have a measure for after they drink the coffee and how well they do on the test. That would be a classic experiment or a true experiment in that instance. So all of those different points have to be met. That criteria has to be met in order for it to be a classic experiment. Now, within experimental research and observational research, there are a number of different variations of these two things. With experimental research, you have a number of different designs like post-test, repeated measurement, multiple group, quasi-experiment, randomized field, and natural experiments. With observational designs, you have cross-sectional, longitudinal, interventional analysis, and trend analysis. And we'll go through and talk about each one of these individually and how they differ from each other. Let's start with the experimental design. So first, there's the post-test design. A lot like our classic experimental design, it has a controlled environment, you have a control group, and you have a test group. You also have an independent variable and a dependent variable. There's random assignment, and there's treatment and manipulation. So it sounds a lot like the classic experiment we would use with the coffee and the test scores, but there is one major difference. There is no pre-test assigned as part of this design. So let's think about our example with coffee and students. So we'll include all of these factors. The students will still be in a controlled environment. Some will be randomly assigned to control group. Some will be randomly assigned to the treatment group. We would have an independent variable. We would have a dependent variable. And there would be treatment of coffee, but we wouldn't have a pretest. So that means that in this instance, I would just take the scores for the students after having the coffee for the experimental group and not having the coffee for the control group. And then I would look at the difference between those two groups and come to my conclusion that coffee was the reason to see that difference between those two groups. Now, this type of design, as you probably are thinking along these lines as you listen to this, it can be a little less credible for a lot of people because you don't have that baseline of the pretest to see where students stood before they drank the coffee. So it tends to not be as credible as the classic true experimental design, but it still adds to the body of knowledge and still gives us considerable information about the relationship between two variables. The next type of experimental design would be the repeated measure design. Now, in the repeated measure design, we still have the controlled environment and we have two groups as we would in the classic design, a treatment group and a control group. We have an independent variable and a dependent variable, coffee, test scores. We have random assignment, and we also have the treatment of the coffee being applied to one group and not the other group. But the major difference here is kind of like its name, repeated measurement. Instead of having a pre-test and a post-test, we have a number of pre-tests and post-tests. So for our example with the coffee and the students, let's say we give a number of exams over the course of the semester beforehand. They have to take those exams without coffee for both groups. They're divided up, randomly assigned to those groups. And then we give them coffee. And then after giving them coffee, they have to take a number of other exams on the coffee for the experimental group. And then we're able to get the differences in their test scores there for those same tests. So you may have three pre-tests that they all have to take, the control group and the treatment group. And then three post-tests, using it as an example, that they all have to take after the coffee. And then because we use repeated measures, we're not just looking at the difference on one test, but three different tests. It's said to be a more accurate way of looking at the the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable. Because it's one thing to say that, hey, it had an effect on one test, or we see this major difference in one test. But multiple tests tends to add to the legitimacy of what you're saying is going on there, and the internal validity for the actual study. The repeated measure design also allows for you to be able to see where the impact actually happens with the coffee. So let's say for our example, we're doing all three of these tests in one single day, and we gave them the coffee right before the first test. And we look at their differences on their test scores, and we see that the biggest difference between the control group and the experimental group was around the time of taking test number 2. So we then say that around hour number 3, using that as an example, that is when the application of the manipulation of the treatment, the coffee, had the biggest effect. So then we're able to see the changes and the trends over time as far as the impact that the manipulation had on the dependent variable. The next type of design we could have could be a multiple group design. And with the multiple group design, again, we have a controlled environment. We're either in a lab or like some sort of isolated classroom. We have the manipulation, again, with the coffee, applying the coffee random assignments to the groups. But what's different here is that instead of having just one control group and one treatment group, we could have more than one. We will have more than one experimental group or more than one control group and different levels of the independent variable. And also the way that we test here, it varies. We could do just a post test only, pre and a post test, or a repeated measures way of testing where we test them over different intervals, multiple tests. So let's think about our example here. What would this look like? With the multiple group design, we may decide to have 3 experimental groups and 1 control group. We have 1 group that is not going to receive any sort of coffee, any sort of caffeine. But then we have 3 other groups that will receive caffeine. And we put them all into these groups randomly. But the 3 groups that are the experimental groups don't just receive caffeine, but they receive different levels of caffeine. So maybe with experimental group 1, we give them 100 milligrams. Experimental group 2, we give them 200 milligrams. And experimental group 3, we give them 500 milligrams. And then we go and we look at the differences across all of those different groups. We may give them a post test only, or we may do a pre test and a post test for all groups, or we may do repeated measures where we give them 3 different exams for every group. We can choose whatever we want to do there. But the important distinction with this one from the classical design is that there's more than one experimental group or control group and different levels of the independent variable. So instead of just giving them all coffee or all the same coffee, we're giving them 3 different levels of the coffee there. But as you may or may not know, everything cannot be studied in a controlled environment like a laboratory. So the next group of experiments we're going to talk about take place outside of a controlled environment. Everything can't be studied in a lab, so we have to look at some things in the real world. Those that cannot be conducted in a lab are called field experiments. In a field experiment, you still have a random assignment, you still have the manipulation or the treatment, and you have at least one control group and one treatment group. But you're not in a control environment, you're in the real world. And typically in a field experiment, you don't have a pretest because you're in the real world and you're able to only see the difference between the two things on the as far as the manipulation for the control group and for the um, experimental group. So, what would be an example of a field experiment that we may see in life, like on a college campus? Well, let's think about Camp War Eagle. We have Camp War Eagle taking place right before the semester starts, and we want to see the impact that incentives have on people registering to vote. So we go to Camp War Eagle, we pass out voter registration packs to all of the new incoming freshmen that'll be attending Auburn. And in every other packet that we pass out, we include a $10 gift certificate to Chick-fil-A with proof of new registration. And in the other packets, we don't include any sort of incentive or gift certificate to Chick-fil-A. We just include the voter registration pack and ask all the students to make sure that they register to vote. And then we go back and we see, based upon how many people registered to vote that came from Camp War Eagle, or how many gift certificates that were redeemed to Chick-fil-A, and see what the difference is between the two groups. So we'll look and see that all of these people, they registered to vote, but only 10 of them redeemed a Chick-fil-A gift certificate. Only 10 Chick-fil-A gift certificates were redeemed. Or we see that we gave out 500 packets and 250 of them had Chick-fil-A gift certificates, and 250 Chick-fil-A gift certificates were redeemed, and 300 total Camp War Eagle students registered to vote, which means that 250 of those who received the coupon, all of them registered to vote, and only 50 of the ones who didn't receive the coupon registered to vote. That would be an example of a field experiment. Why? Because we don't have the controlled environment of a lab setting. That's the major difference there. We have to use a practical environment, because when we're studying a lot of things in public administration and political science in general, it's really hard to study those things in a controlled environment for many of them. So that would be an example of a field experiment for in a like a political science setting, and something that you may be able to relate to in your everyday life. The next type of experiment would be a natural experiment. Now, in a natural experiment, you are not in a controlled environment. That's for sure. The next thing is that you receive the treatment or the manipulation, but it's done by nature instead of by the researcher. And you have groups, but it's not randomly assigned by the researcher. Nature assigns participants to the control and the experimental group. And this type of experiment tends to have high external validity. Why? Because it took place in the real world already. But it tends to have a little bit of a challenge with internal validity because of all of the extraneous factors that could go on in the world that could also have an impact on it. I'll give you guys an example to kind of make this clearer. So let's use something that's present and pressing. COVID-19, coronavirus. Coronavirus is something that has taken the world by storm. And in order to understand the impact of coronavirus, we want to do a study 50 years into the future of the effects that coronavirus had on those who were in gestation, who were not born yet, but who were in the womb at the time coronavirus took over and took the world by storm. So we would go through and we would look at children born, let's say, in the spring, summer, and fall of 2020. And we will follow children who were born in the spring, summer, and fall of 2019, for example. So then we have our two groups that are assigned by nature. The ones born in 2019 were a part of the control group because they were not exposed to coronavirus during gestation. The ones who were born in the spring, summer, and fall of 2020 were in gestation during coronavirus. So they would be the experimental group as assigned by nature, because this is something that we cannot control. And then we want to follow these individuals over the course of their lives and see if there is some sort of difference between these two groups of people as far as like their psychological well-being, their physical health, maybe even their educational outcomes, right? And then we'll look at the difference between these two groups, where the only thing that is supposedly different between them would be gestation during a pandemic. And then we draw our conclusions from there, looking at their differences on their, let's say, psychological outcomes for the two groups, or looking at the educational differences between the two groups, and say that because of coronavirus, or the impact the coronavirus had, the pandemic had on the population, then it negatively impacted this group of people, right? So that would be an example of a natural experiment there. But the problem with natural experiments is that you cannot control for the things that you can in a classic true experimental setting. One thing that you can't control is the possibility of different levels of treatment received by those who receive the manipulation. So in some instances, you may have people who were in gestation still inside their mom, where their mom actually was infected with coronavirus. And then you may have others who just happened to be in the womb while coronavirus was something that was pressing in the world. And then you're not able to control for those things, or be able, or you're, and you're also not able to distinguish the difference between those two things and how they impact them differently, unless you take some other levels of precaution in the way that you design. But it makes it hard for you to control for those differences, because you don't have the ability. It's out of your hands when you're talking about a natural experiment. But in general, we need to be mindful that field research tends to be less, has less internal validity than, has less internal validity, but has higher external validity than classic experiments. Less internal validity because we're not able to control for these different things, and to just isolate in on how that independent variable impacted that dependent variable, because we're not in a setting where we can solely say that this was a reason for the difference between those two things, because there are other factors that could impact it. But higher external validity because we're looking at the way that things actually work in the real world. Control isn't something that's always there. Okay, so that's an important distinction to make there. Final type of experiment we want to talk about is called a quasi experimental design. A quasi experimental design, quasi meaning semi, it means like it's an semi experiment, because it doesn't hold hard and fast to all of those rules of a classic experimental design. Yes, you have a treatment and a control group, and you can have a pre-test and a post-test, and it can be in a controlled environment, but you don't have a random assignment. Typically, you don't have random assignment in these sorts of studies because it can be difficult or impossible depending on the thing that you're studying. So let's go back to our example about coffee for students and their impact on like a standardized test. So let's use our university for example. Let's say we want to see coffee's impact on students taking political science research methods. But there are two sections of political science research methods. One meets at from 9:30 to 10:45. The other section meets from 1 to 2. And because they already exist in those groups, and that's the time that the class is set, we can't really randomly assign them to classrooms or groups or anything. So instead, we decide we're just going to use one class as the experimental group and one class as the control group. That would be an instance in which random assignment would be a little bit more tricky. So we decide to give the political science research methods class, this first section, section number 1, a cup of coffee. But then the section number 2, we don't give them a cup of coffee. Now we're going to give them a pre-test and a post-test, just like we would in a classical experiment. And we're going to look at the results. But the difference is that we weren't able to randomly assign to those groups because they're already situated in those classes. And we'll look at the differences between the groups, and we'll draw the conclusion that those differences exist because one group received the manipulation, the treatment on the independent variable, and another group did not receive the manipulation on the independent variable. But again, we run into the issue of it being a little less credible than the classic experimental design because it's not random. Why does randomness matter so much? Well, it matters so much because you can't be 100% sure that you don't just have more motivated students in section number one than section number two. And you can't just be sure that you just don't have students who have a higher proficiency or understanding of research methods in section number one than section number two, and that being the reason that you see the differences between the two. But when you're able to randomly assign them to groups, you can be more certain of that. But it still is a viable research design, and it still leads to the development of new knowledge within whatever discipline of study you're studying in. So now that we're done talking about all the different forms of experimental research, let's talk about something that I'm sure you all are a little bit more familiar with in political science and public administration, and that would be observational studies. This is the most common form of research that you see in political science and public administration. The observational research, this is when you see people doing the survey research on how people feel about candidates. This is when you look at changes in GDP. This is when you look at educational outcomes and income. This is when you look at voter turnouts and all of those things. The research that you guys are probably the most comfortable with and most familiar with seeing. You don't have manipulation of variables. If you are not manipulating variables, then you are definitely doing observational research. You are just observing what already exists. The only time you manipulate variables is when you are going in as the researcher and you are making some sort of change or applying some sort of treatment. If you're not doing that, then you are not conducting an experiment. You're using some form of observational research. The next thing is that you don't have random assignments to groups. Again, people already exist in the groups that you're interested in studying. You're just looking to see what exists there. You don't have control over the environment. People already exist in their natural social political environment, and you're just making observations there. And something that is important here is to note that these sorts of studies tend to depend more heavily on statistical power in order to make their assertions and their claims. So this is when you see like all of these different statistical tests being done in the papers that you read. They're talking about the different tests that they use. These are those type of studies. And to talk about these sorts of studies, we're going to go back to our familiar handy dandy example of education and income. Think about it. When we study education and income, we don't go in and change people's education levels, and we don't decide who gets an education and who doesn't. That would be manipulation or altering it. And then see how their finances turn out. Instead, we observe what is naturally occurring. There is no treatment and there is no randomization here. We're just observing things simply as they are. The first type of observational design that you may be familiar with is a cross-sectional design, which is a fancy way of saying a study that measures the independent and the dependent variable, and it's all taken at one time with different measures of those. It takes those responses or those data points, and then we draw conclusions or make inferences about those data points looking at statistics. We look at this type of research and we're still able to meet those four causal hurdles we discussed earlier in class: the credible causal mechanism, the time order, the non-spuriousness, and the covariation. An example of a cross-sectional design that you may see or may be familiar with would be survey research. We go out and we survey people. We survey them on the independent variable and on the dependent variable. Let's say we want to understand how education and income plays a major role in people's lives. So we survey people and we're able to get people who have a high income. We're able to survey people who have a low income. We're able to survey people who have high education, low education, people from different ethnic backgrounds, people from different racial backgrounds, from the different genders, people with different degrees from different places, from different colleges. And what we're doing there is we are taking a cross section of the population who falls into all of these different categories, and we're able to make inferences up to the larger population based on what we find with this cross section. So we call it a cross section because we're taking a sample of the population to get this information. And from that sample, you'll be able to look at different people with different backgrounds and draw conclusions about how the majority or the general population operates. Now, it's hard to say without a shadow of a doubt that education is going to be the cause for income. And that's one of the limitations of this type of study because you lack control. You're not going in and actually manipulating education and income, as I said before. So we can't be 100% sure that the reason why we see those differences on the dependent variable is because of the independent variable, the independent variable being education, the dependent variable being income, but we can get pretty close to 100%. Why? Because we use statistical software and statistical packages. So we operate from data analysis and the logical assumptions of statistical packages that we really don't have to go into a lot of detail of understanding, but there are certain laws and principles that statistics operates in to make it so that we're able to draw the conclusions that we are either 95% certain of, 90% certain of, or 99% certain of. And some of the advantages of using this form of research design is that we're able to make observations in natural settings. We don't have to do anything difficult or cumbersome to get people to fill out a survey to provide us with their information. We're also able to increase the size that we're able to use for our study. It's different when you have a lab setting. There are only so many people you can get in the room, but the number of people you can get to fill out a survey is limitless. And we're able to improve our representativeness of our study. In a sample, we can pull people from all different backgrounds, as I said, and the more people that you have with more variation in the people that you include in your study, the more you're able to say about the larger population. And a final advantage is that you're able to actually test hypotheses. We talked about in the beginning of the semester, null hypotheses and alternative hypotheses. And you're able to test these hypotheses when you use this form of study because then the statistical software that you use or the method that you use to analyze your data is able to tell you whether or not your hypothesis can be accepted or it has to be rejected. Now, two other limitations that I've kind of discussed already here would be the lack of control. Because you're not in a controlled environment, there are going to be extraneous factors that could play a role, and that's why we're not 100% certain. And the level of internal validity is more skeptical than a classical study. But the level of external validity is higher because we're observing people in their natural setting. So we have to know that what we find here has to hold for the larger population because this is the actual population and they're not being manipulated into doing anything. They're giving us their genuine information about different things. And a second limitation will be our inability to form peer groups because we're not going in controlling and manipulating things. We can't just set people into a group of these are the highly educated and these are the lowly educated. People typically have variation within them and the way that they experience the independent and dependent variable when you're not manipulating them. So that becomes a challenge as well. The next form of observational design that you may see would be a longitudinal study. And this is something that is very popular in psychology that I've noticed, longitudinal studies. In longitudinal studies, you're looking at the measures of the independent variable and the dependent variable across time rather than once. So that means that if we're looking to understand education and income for individuals, instead of just getting a one-time snapshot and getting them to fill out a survey there, we will look at those changes over time. And using this sort of study allows us to look at changes and they can be measured and modeled. And it also helps in fulfilling the time order criteria for the four hurdles of causality we talked about before. If we're looking at them over time, then we can be sure that education happened before income because we're following them through their education process. So let's think about our example here. So let's say we take a group of college freshmen and we give them a survey at the end of year one in college. And in giving them that survey, we ask them what their current income is. For most college students typically are poor. So let's say they'd say they're making $18,000 a year. And then we come back and we give them another survey 5 years following that survey, that same group. And then we see they give us the different amounts that they're making then. Some of the students may have dropped out of school, some may have stayed in school, but we still take their measures there. And then we look at it 10 years down the road, give them another survey. 15 years, 20 years, 25 years down the road. And then we're able to establish what that relationship looks like between education and income for these individuals. So now you may have somebody who is a professional who has been in their field for 5 years and they're making $50,000. And then we see they decided later on down the road they got a master's degree, and 10 years down the line they're making $75,000, right? So we're able to see that as they become more and more educated, then their income has also gone up. And we may see that the person who after freshman year kind of decided college wasn't for them and they wanted to find themselves at the 5 year mark, they may still be making, instead of making $18,000, maybe now they're making around $27,000. But then we follow them over the course of time and they still decided not to get any more education, and maybe now they're making $32,000. And then at the 10-year mark, maybe they're making $35,000. And then we're able to look at those trends over time for those two groups. So again, with the longitudinal studies, we're looking at the measures of the independent variable and the dependent variable across time. We don't have any sort of like control on the independent variable, no randomization or anything. We're just simply observing what's naturally happening for the individuals who are part of the study, and then making our inferences up to the population about what exists between our independent variable, education, and our dependent variable, income, based on what we see when we follow these individuals over time. So what are the advantages of this? Well, one main advantage is that we're able to model and measure change. That's something that you can't really do in the cross-sectional, because we just gave a bunch of people from a bunch of different backgrounds a survey just to see where they stand. But when we follow people over the course of time, we're able to see how things change and progress. The next thing, as I said, time order. You're able to make sure that the education precedes the income. But one major concern we have with longitudinal studies is the maturation. Things happen within studies. One of those things being people start to understand and realize what it is that you're studying, and they may not respond as truthfully as they would had it just been a one-time thing. So they start realizing, okay, this person is really trying to figure out what my income is, so I'm not going to tell them 100% the truth. Or you may also have an issue of maturation where, unfortunately, people die. Sometimes people die and then you lose that line of data for that longitudinal point. And then another thing that happens is that sometimes people just decide not to participate in the study. People move, you may not have their updated address, or they decide, hey, I don't want to fill out this survey anymore. And then they just drop out, and then you lose those data points there. But some additional benefits that you have from using longitudinal studies is that we're able to establish 3 different effects. So we're able to look at the age effects, the period effects, and we're able to look at the cohort effects. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail here about them, but I'm going to tell you what these things are because it may be something that's important for the thing that you're studying. First, the age effect is the effect associated with getting older. One way we see this happening is in studies about political conservatism, and let's say we're getting measures for individuals every 5 years, and we notice that as they got older, then they tend to become more conservative. So how age changes the participants in the study is something that you're able to point out and note there. The next thing would be period effects, and that's the effect a specific period of time has on the individuals. For example, you're able to look at individuals, let's say, if we're looking at education and income, you may be able to look at those who grew up in the civil rights era and how that impacted the relationship between their education and income, and you can parse that out. Or those who grew up during the 9/11 era, the era of the war on terrorism, and see how that impacted their education and income. So that's just an example of like the time period thing. But a third one would be the cohort effects, and that is the effects of shared life experience at the same time. So you can look at all of the individuals, for example, in our study that we use of entering college at the same time. All of those individuals who decided to enter and complete college, you look at them as a cohort or as a group and see how that impacted education and income for that group of individuals. So those are all like little differences you can parse out and talk about when you're analyzing your results. The next type of study we want to talk about will be the intervention analysis study. And with the intervention analysis study, we're looking at measurements of the DV, the dependent variable, taken before and after the introduction of the independent variable. We're able to get these pre-measurements and to establish trend lines, and then we take those measurements and we compare those to the post-test. So let me explain this to you using our example. We take measures of education and income. Let's say for the students, we want to take a second look at those who decided not to finish college, right? And then we look at the subgroup inside of there who didn't decide to finish college in the traditional college age years, which is like 18 to 24. But later on in life, they decided to go back as non-traditional students. And we want to see how that impacts their education and income. So we use our pretest measure, the income that they had before they decided to go back to college. And we take that trend line, we take that baseline, and we establish a trend line from there. Okay, it looks like these people are about here who decided not to complete college. And then we follow them as they decide to go through and return to school. And we look, and that will be the intervention of the independent variable, which would be the education. We look at that impact that it had on for those individuals when they received that intervention of going back to school. So I'm saying that individuals who did not have a college degree will take a baseline of what their income is. And then we'll look at how that changed after they decided to go back to school as non-traditional students. And then we'll look and see, are there noticeable differences? Well, they were making about 27,000 here. They went back to school, and then we see this giant spike up to about 45,000 after they graduated. Would it be an increase or would it be a decrease, or did it stay about the same? They were making 27,000 before. They went to school, they graduated from college, but they're still making about 27,000. So we would look at those differences. Or would it be an instance where their income actually went down? They were making 27,000, they went to college, it dropped down to 18,000, they graduated and they got a job for 25,000. We will look at all those different things and look at those trend lines. So we'll first establish a trend line before they went back to school, and we'll be able to see, okay, what are the averages there? And then we'll see what happens after they go to school, and then compare the differences between those two, and then be able to say that the independent variable was the reason why we see the difference between on the dependent variable between the two time periods before and after the intervention on the independent variable. Lots of fancy words to say simple things that we're used to hearing about and that we've been exposed to. But a downfall of this type of study, as with the rest of the observational studies, is that you lack control. You're not able to apply education and income to people in the way that you would like to, because one, that would be unethical, and two, because it's just not possible. You can't choose who receives education and who does not receive education, at least in the United States. So we have to take into account that lack of control that exists there. The final type of analysis we're going to talk about in chapter 9 would be the trend analysis. So using trend analysis is something that you're probably super common and familiar with if you ever read a report of any kind. In trend analysis, we're assessing the measurement of the dependent variable over time. So in our example, the dependent variable would be income. We just want to look at the trend for a group of people over time. So using, for example, let's say we survey people over the last 30 years in general, and we just look at the average pay for Americans. Is it going up, what the average person makes over the last 30 years? So we start in 1990 and see what the average pay is, and we look and see, is it progressively going up? We look at the literature, and the literature says that since 1990, studies have shown that the cost of living is constantly going up. And then we survey people every year, and we survey all the people, kind of like a census, and we get their income, and we see that, well, income on average isn't going up for American citizens. They aren't becoming more and more richer. Income is actually staying the same. And with trend analysis, we can't really say why that's happening, because we're just looking at the average. We're not drawing a relationship between two different things. We're just looking at the way that one thing moves through time. In this example, that would be income. We're just looking at the trends that we see in income. But if we want to be able to say something about the relationship between education and income using a trend analysis, then we would have to conduct something called a time series analysis, which is beyond the scope of this class, but it would show us the relationship over time between education and income if that was something we were interested in studying. With trend analysis, we're not able to establish a causal explanation because we're only looking at one variable. And anytime you're only looking at one variable, you're not able to talk about relationships because a relationship requires two in science and in real life. So we're only able to talk about the trend we see there or the averages we see over time. So now we've made it to the end of our discussion in chapter 9 about all of the different methods of quantitative analysis, all of the different designs that we can use. And you may be saying to yourself, which one is the right one? Which one is the one to use? And my simple answer to you is that the right design to use, the right method to use depends upon your research question and your data source. There are only certain designs that apply to certain things. I have given you a wide variety of different ones depending on the things that you're studying, but every design doesn't apply to your question. If you're interested in education and income, you can't do an experiment. You can't do a classical experiment. And if you're interested in the impact on coffee on students' test scores, then it's going to be really difficult to do a cross-sectional analysis. So those are just different things to keep in mind. Depending on the things you study, the things that you study determine which design that you would have to use for your study. If you're needing more clarity on this and trying to figure out which design will be the best for the things that you're interested in, feel free to reach out to me and we can have a conversation about it. But I want to make sure that you understand that there are lots of different options. We talked about them in chapter 8 and we talked about them in chapter 9. This is just giving you an overview of all of the different things that are possible with the things that you're interested in studying, but it's not saying that this one is the one that you have to use for your study. When I go through and we talk about this a little bit more in detail as we get into more of the meat of research designs, then we can determine whether or not a design is appropriate for the thing that you're interested in. But that pretty much concludes our discussion in chapter 9. And I'll be back with you with a discussion for chapter 10. Stay tuned.